I remember the exact moment everything changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a glance, one that lasted a second too long but felt like eternity. It was my father's introduction ceremony. The house was alive that evening, buzzing with the hum of voices, laughter, and the smell of sizzling goat meat on the grill. My uncle had insisted I come. He said it was a big deal, my father finally settling down after years of being alone. I wasn't excited. I didn't want to go. How could he move on so quickly from my mother? Her memory still felt fresh in the house. The little prayer altar she used every morning was still in the corner of the living room. And now he wanted to replace her. I only came because my uncle wouldn't stop talking about how important it was. "You are the first son," he kept saying. "You should support him." But when I saw her, Adan, everything in my head shifted. She didn't look like anyone I had imagined. She was younger than my father, way younger, maybe just a few years older than me. Her skin was smooth and dark, and she had this calm way of moving, like nothing could shake her. She wasn't just beautiful, she was hard to ignore. I saw her across the room, talking to one of my father's cousins. She laughed at something, and for some reason, I couldn't stop looking. Then she turned and caught me staring. I froze. But instead of looking away, she smiled. It wasn't one of those fake, polite smiles you give when you meet someone new. It felt real, like she knew exactly what was in my mind. I told myself I was imagining things. She was just trying to be nice. But when I saw her glance at me again, the same smile was there, warm, familiar, and it scared me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. I felt stupid for thinking so much about it. She was my father's bride, not some random girl. Still, something about her stayed with me. The way she moved, the way she smiled. It felt different, like she was trying to tell me something without using words. The next morning, I avoided her as much as I could. My father had asked me to help set up chairs for another family meeting, so I threw myself into the work. But Adan was everywhere. She wasn't loud or in my face, but her presence filled the house. Even when I couldn't see her, I knew she was close. It made my chest feel tight. At some point, I was carrying a stack of chairs when she walked past me. She was holding a tray of drinks for the guests. Her wrapper was tied loosely around her waist, and her perfume lingered in the air as she moved. I didn't mean to stare, but my eyes followed her until she noticed. She turned back and smiled. "You're working too hard," she said, her voice light. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. She walked closer and handed me a glass of water. Her fingers brushed against mine, and for a second, the world felt still. I looked up at her, and her eyes held mine. There was something there, something I didn't understand, but I couldn't look away. "You should take a break," she said softly before walking off. I stood there holding the glass, my heart beating fast. Was it all in my head, or was there something real between us? 2 weeks later, my father left for the city on business. It wasn't unusual. He often traveled for work, but this time felt different. The house was quiet without him, and for the first time, it was just me and Adan. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. She was family now, or at least she would be soon. But the silence in the house felt heavy, like it was holding secrets I wasn't ready to face. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I tossed and turned for hours before finally deciding to go to the kitchen for some water. As I opened the door, I saw her sitting at the dining table. She was wearing a loose wrapper tied around her chest, her hair falling over her shoulders. The dim light from the kitchen bulb made her look softer, more real. She looked up when she heard me. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. I shook my head, avoiding her gaze. "No," I said, "just thirsty." She smiled and gestured to the chair across from her. "Come, sit with me. It's too quiet in this house." I hesitated. I knew I should say no, I knew I should just get my water and go back to my room. But instead I sat down. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. She sipped from a mug, her eyes watching me carefully. "You don't talk much," she said finally. "Why is that?" I shrugged, not trusting myself to say anything more. But she didn't let it go. "Is it me?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Do I make you uncomfortable?" "No," I said quickly. "It's not that." "Then what is it?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly. Her wrapper shifted, and I looked away, feeling my face grow warm. She laughed softly, and the sound filled the empty house. "You're a strange one," she said, "but I like that." That night at the table felt like a spark, a quiet thing that could have been ignored, but wasn't. Adan's words stayed with me long after I went back to my room. "You're a strange one, but I like that." The way she said it wasn't casual. It felt like a hand reaching out, daring me to take it. I lay awake for hours, thinking about her, about the way her wrapper had slipped just enough to show her shoulder, the way her eyes seemed to hold secrets. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but the thought of her wouldn't leave me. The next day, I tried to avoid her, but the house wasn't big enough. Every time I turned a corner, there she was, folding clothes in the living room, humming a tune in the kitchen, sitting outside in the yard with her hair tied back. She was everywhere, and I couldn't escape her. And worse, I didn't want to. It was later that evening when it happened again. I was fixing something in the storage room when I heard her voice behind me. "You've been hiding from me," she said, her tone teasing. I turned to face her, and she was leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed. She was wearing a simple blouse and skirt, but somehow it looked like more than that. Or maybe it was just her. "I haven't been hiding," I said quickly, but my voice betrayed me. She raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because it feels like you have." She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. The air felt heavier immediately. She walked closer, her eyes locked on mine. "Why are you afraid of me?" she asked, her voice soft now. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, but it came out as a whisper. She was standing so close now I could see the faint curve of her collarbone, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. She smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was knowing, dangerous. "Then why can't you look at me?" she asked. I tried to look away, but her hand came up, gentle but firm, tilting my chin so I had no choice. Her fingers lingered, warm against my skin. "You're different," she said quietly, "not like your father." Her words sent a jolt through me. I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't want to ask. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as she'd come, she stepped back, letting her hand fall to her side. "You should stop hiding," she said, her voice light again. "It doesn't suit you." And with that, she was gone, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding. After that day, the tension in the house became unbearable. Adan acted like nothing had happened, but I couldn't. Every time she walked past me, every time she smiled, it felt like she was playing a game I didn't understand, and I was losing. One afternoon, my father called to check on us. I could hear his deep voice booming through Adan's phone as they spoke in the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending not to listen, but every word felt like a knife. He asked if everything was fine, if I was behaving myself. She laughed, the sound so natural it made my stomach twist. "Of course," she said, "everything is perfect." Perfect. The word felt wrong. Nothing about this was perfect. When she ended the call, she walked into the kitchen, her phone still in her hand. "He misses you," she said, leaning against the counter. "I doubt that," I muttered. I didn't mean for her to hear it, but she did. She tilted her head, watching me. "You don't like him much, do you?" she asked. I didn't answer. What could I say? That I resented him for moving on so easily, for bringing her here and turning my world upside down? She stepped closer, her eyes searching mine. "You're allowed to feel how you feel," she said softly. "Nobody can take that from you." Her words caught me off guard. For a moment, it felt like she understood me, like she saw through everything I was trying to hide. And then, her hand brushed against mine as she reached for the glass on the counter. It was a small thing, but it sent a shock through me. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. She stood there, so close I could feel the warmth of her skin. "You shouldn't let him control you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're better than that." I didn't know what she meant, but the way she said it made it feel important. Before I could respond, she turned and left the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my thoughts spinning. It happened late one night, after a power outage left the house in darkness. I was in my room, trying to distract myself from the heat and the silence, when I heard her voice outside my door. "Are you awake?" she asked. I froze, unsure of what to do. After a moment, I got up and opened the door. She was standing there, holding a small lantern, her face glowing softly in the light. "The heat is too much," she said, her voice low. "Can I come in?" I hesitated. I knew I should say no. I should tell her to go back to her room. But instead, I stepped aside, letting her in. She set the lantern on the table and sat on the edge of my bed, her hands resting in her lap. "This house feels strange without him," she said, looking around. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The sight of her sitting there in the dim light was too much. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "You don't have to be afraid of me," she said. "I'm not going to hurt you." "I'm not afraid," I said, but my voice betrayed me. She stood up and walked closer, stopping just a few inches away. "Then what is it?" she asked. "What's stopping you?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. And then, slowly, she reached out and touched my face, her fingers light against my skin. "You don't have to hold back," she said softly. "Not with me." The room felt too small. Her hand lingered on my face, warm and steady, and I couldn't move. My mind was screaming at me to push her away, to say something, anything, but I stood there, frozen. Her eyes held mine, and for the first time, I saw something I couldn't unsee. She wanted me too. It wasn't in words. It was in the way her breathing slowed, the way her lips parted slightly, like she was waiting for me to make a move. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "You should go," I said, my voice unsteady. It was the right thing to say, but it felt like a lie. Her face didn't change. She didn't look hurt or surprised. She just tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to figure me out. "Why?" she asked simply. Her voice wasn't teasing this time. It was serious, almost sad. "Why do you keep running from me?" I didn't know how to answer. She took a step closer, closing the gap I had just made. "Do you think I don't feel it too?" she asked. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper, but every word hit me like a hammer. "I've felt it since the first day I saw you. You think it's just in your head, but it's not. It's real." Her words terrified me. I turned away, unable to face her. "This isn't right," I said, my voice shaking. "You're marrying my father." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Do you think he cares about me?" she asked. "To him, I'm just a trophy, something he can show off to his friends. You know that as well as I do." I didn't respond. I couldn't. She stepped closer again, so close I could feel her breath on my neck. "But you're different," she said. "You see me, and I see you." Her words left me raw, exposed. I wanted to push her away, to tell her she was wrong, but I didn't. I couldn't. I wanted her, and I hated myself for it. The days that followed felt like a game I didn't know how to play. Adan acted like nothing had happened, but her presence weighed on me like a shadow. She was everywhere, laughing in the living room, humming in the kitchen, sitting outside with her legs tucked under her like she didn't have a care in the world. But every time she looked at me, I felt it. the pull, the tension, and I knew she felt it too. One evening, we were in the living room. The power had gone out again, and the house was lit only by candles. She was sitting on the couch, her legs curled up under her wrapper slipping slightly off her shoulder. I sat across from her, trying not to look, but my eyes betrayed me. She caught me staring. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice soft. I shrugged. "There's nothing to say." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You always have something to say," she said. "You just don't want to say it." I didn't respond. I couldn't trust myself to speak. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Why do you fight it so much?" she asked. "Because it's wrong," I said finally. My voice was quiet, but the words felt heavy. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "What's wrong about it?" she asked. "That we feel something? That we're honest about it?" Her words made my chest tighten. "You're marrying my father," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. She leaned back, her smile fading. "And what does that mean?" she asked. "That I'm his property, that I can't have my own thoughts, my own feelings." Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with something I couldn't name. "You think I chose this?" Her words left me stunned. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her facade. She wasn't just confident and composed. She was trapped, and somehow I was part of her escape. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Her words kept replaying in my mind. "You think I chose this?" What did she mean? Why would she agree to marry my father if she didn't want to? The questions swirled in my head, and before I knew it, I was standing outside her door. I hesitated. This was a bad idea. I knew it was, but before I could turn away, the door opened. She stood there, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to talk to you," I said, my voice low. She stepped back, letting me in. The room was small, but it felt even smaller, with the two of us in it. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "What's on your mind?" she asked. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Why are you marrying him?" I asked finally. "If you don't love him, why are you doing this?" She looked down at her hands, her expression unreadable. "Because I don't have a choice," she said quietly. "My family needs the money. He offered to help them if I agreed." Her words hit me like a punch. I didn't know what to say. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "Do you understand now?" she asked. "This isn't about love. It never was." Her confession left me reeling. I wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that we could find a way out together. But before I could say anything, she stood up and walked over to me. "But you're different," she said. Her voice was soft, but her words were firm. "With you, it feels real." She was so close now, I could feel the warmth of her body. Her hand came up, resting lightly on my chest. "Tell me I'm wrong," she said. "Tell me you don't feel the same." I couldn't. I didn't have the strength to lie. Her hand on my chest felt like fire. I should have stepped back, told her to stop, but I couldn't. My body refused to move, and the space between us seemed to vanish. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked on mine, waiting, challenging me to make a choice. And I made the wrong one. I leaned in. It wasn't planned, wasn't thought out. My lips brushed against hers, hesitant at first, but then the world seemed to fall away. She kissed me back, and suddenly nothing else existed. Not my father, not the house, not the shame that would follow. It was just us, tangled in something we couldn't control. Her fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt, pulling me closer. She smelled like the faint perfume she always wore, mixed with the heat of the night, and it made my head spin. My hands hovered at her waist, unsure of where to go, what to do. But she didn't hesitate. She pressed against me, her movements urgent, desperate, like she was trying to erase every boundary between us. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. She pulled back, her breathing uneven, her hands still clutching my shirt. "We can't," she whispered, but her words felt hollow. Her eyes betrayed her. She didn't want to stop any more than I did. "I know," I said, though the words felt meaningless. My hands dropped to my sides, and I stepped back, the reality of what we'd done hitting me like a wave. She turned away, her arms wrapping around herself as if to shield her from what had just happened. "Your father will be back tomorrow," she said, her voice barely audible. This can't happen again." I nodded, though every part of me wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but I didn't. I couldn't. The damage was already done. The next morning, the house was silent. Adan stayed in her room, and I avoided her door. I couldn't face her, not after what had happened. I spent the day outside, working in the yard, trying to clear my head. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't escape the memory of her, of us. By the time my father's car pulled into the driveway, I felt like I was unraveling. He stepped out, his voice loud and cheerful as he called out to me. "How was the house?" he asked, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "I hope you didn't give Adan too much trouble." I forced a smile, my stomach twisting. "Everything was fine," I said, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. Adan appeared at the door, her face calm, composed. She greeted my father with a smile, the same smile she always wore, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. But then her eyes met mine, just for a second, and I knew I hadn't. The memory of her kiss, her touch, burned in the space between us. That evening, the house was full again, my father talking loudly about his trip, Adan laughing softly at his jokes. I sat in silence, my hands clenched under the table. Every time she looked at him, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about her words. This can't happen again. But the worst part was the question that lingered in my mind. What if it did? The days after my father returned were unbearable. Adan avoided me, and I avoided her. But even in the silence, the tension between us refused to fade. It hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, like a secret threatening to burst. My father, oblivious as ever, filled the house with his booming laughter and endless stories of his trip. Each time he looked at her, spoke to her, touched her hand, it felt like my insides were being ripped apart. One afternoon, my father asked me to take Adan to the market. He said he had some visitors coming and needed supplies. I wanted to refuse, to come up with an excuse, but I couldn't. Adan didn't seem fazed. She nodded quietly and grabbed her bag. The car ride to the market was silent. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel her beside me, the space between us thick with everything we weren't saying. As we pulled into the market, she finally spoke. "You've barely looked at me since he came back." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, refusing to turn to her. "What do you expect me to do?" She sighed, a long, tired sound. "I don't know. Maybe talk to me. Pretend I exist." I parked the car and turned to her. "Pretend you exist," I said, my voice low but sharp. "You think this is easy for me? I can't even look at him without—" I stopped myself, shaking my head. "Just forget it." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine. "You think I don't feel it too?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, she opened the door and stepped out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The tension in the house grew unbearable after the market trip. My father, ever perceptive in business but blind in his personal life, didn't notice the cracks forming. He was busy planning the wedding, making calls, and hosting friends. But I could see it, Adan's smile faltering when he spoke to her, the way her eyes lingered on me when she thought no one was watching. One evening, after my father had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the back porch. The cool night air did little to calm my nerves. I didn't hear her come outside until she was sitting next to me, her presence as quiet as a shadow. "I can't do this anymore," she said suddenly. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling in her lap. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her I felt the same, that the guilt was eating me alive. But before I could speak, she turned to me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "I can't marry him," she said. "Not when—" Her words trailed off, but she didn't need to finish. I knew what she was going to say, not when she felt the same pull I did, not when the lines had already been crossed. "Then don't," I said, my voice firm. It was the first time I had said it out loud, and the weight of the words hit me like a punch. She looked at me, her eyes wide. "And then what?" she asked. "Run away? Leave everything behind? You don't understand what that means." I wanted to tell her I didn't care, that I would do whatever it took to be with her. But the words caught in my throat, and in that silence, she stood up and walked away, leaving me alone with the storm raging inside me. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur. The house was filled with people, family, friends, vendors, all preparing for the big day. I felt like a ghost, moving through the chaos without really being there. Adan was the same. She smiled when she needed to, laughed at the right moments, but her eyes told a different story. The night before the wedding, I found myself in the kitchen, unable to sleep. Adan walked in, her steps quiet but purposeful. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring out the window. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unbearable. "Are you really going to do it?" I asked finally. My voice was quiet, almost a whisper. She didn't turn around. "Do I have a choice?" I stood up, my fists clenched at my sides. "Yes, you do. You don't have to do this." She turned to me then, her eyes filled with tears. "And then what?" she asked. "What happens after I say no? Do you have an answer for that? Because I don't." Her words hit me like a blow. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what came next. All I knew was that the thought of her standing at the altar with my father made me feel like I was drowning. She took a step closer, her voice soft now. "This is bigger than you and me. It's about my family. It's about survival." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She was right. This wasn't just about us. And that realization felt like the end of everything. The wedding went on as planned. My father stood tall beside his bride, a proud smile on his face. He greeted guests, shook hands, and laughed loudly at every joke. To him, it was the perfect day. I stayed in the corner, out of the way, watching everything unfold. My chest felt tight, and every breath came with a weight I couldn't shake. Adan moved through the room with grace, her laughter soft and easy. She wore the smile everyone expected of her, but I saw what no one else did. The moments when her eyes would find mine. It was quick, fleeting, but enough to bring back everything we'd shared. The weight of what we hadn't said hung between us, heavy and suffocating. Life didn't stop after that day. My father and Adan moved on as though nothing had happened. They slipped into their roles, building the life they had promised each other. I stayed on the sidelines, watching, waiting, trying to convince myself I could forget. But the tension never went away. It followed me, followed her, lurking in every quiet moment, every passing glance. At night, when the house was still, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moments over and over. Her voice, her touch, the way her eyes had lingered on mine. It all stayed with me, haunting me like a memory that refused to fade. I'd think about what could have been, about what I could have done differently. But there were no answers, only questions that cut deeper the longer they lingered. Adan and I never spoke about what happened. We avoided being alone together, avoided the spaces where the past could creep back in. But even in silence, It was there, a shadow, a secret, a bond we couldn't escape, no matter how hard we tried. And in the spaces between, where my father laughed and the world moved on, I would catch her looking at me. Just a glance, just a moment, and everything would come rushing back. Some things never leave, some wounds never heal, and some shadows follow you, no matter how far you try to run.